to arrive at a place of true self-worth, of a high value of self-worth for ourselves, how do we do it? There's a scene in the movie Mean Girls where the three most popular, beautiful, young teenage girls are gathered around a mirror, and it's the three girls on the right, and they're gathered around this mirror, and as they're looking in the mirror, they're picking apart their own self-worth. They're picking apart their own body images. One of them is saying, "Oh, my pores are so big." Another one says, "I have such a weird hairline." Another one complains about her hips. And then they turn to Lindsay Lohan's character, who is the new girl, Cady Heron. You see, Cady has been homeschooled in her life, and she doesn't understand the social norms and how to play these games yet. And they look to Cady, waiting for Cady to join the game. And after a few beats of awkward silence, Cady finally says, "My breath smells bad in the morning." And all the other girls go, "Ew." But there's something so universal about this idea of self-worth and the image that we hold about ourselves, of how we view our own self-worth. And I grew up in the early aughts, as they now call it, the early 2000s, in the day and age of 00 jeans, where you needed to be stick thin. You had low-rise jeans if you were a cool person. And listen, y'all, these Scottish thighs of mine have always been a part of my heritage. And I wonder if for you, if you can go back to formative times in your life and immediately pick out something in your own self-identity that you would identify was wrong. Whether it had to do with your physical image, something about you weren't with the right group, or something about a sport that you hadn't achieved enough in, or or even just an achievement and in general that you hadn't unlocked, a parent you hadn't earned enough love from, etc., etc., etc. Shame is a universal experience. Yet, I would wager that if we were to take a poll of the room, we would all say that we want to have a high value on our own self-worth. So why then is it so hard so many times to actually make that a reality? Why so many times are we still like the plastics, the mean girls, staring at ourselves in the full-length mirror, picking out the most nuanced things that are wrong with us? Well, one option that we could do is that we could just ignore these emotions and feelings that come up within us. That's called numbing. It's a technique, it's a solution that you could choose. But when you do that, that has been proven to lead to things like, oh, these simple addictions like emotional eating, gambling addictions, and alcoholism. So probably not the best solution to choose. So if we have to face our shame, if we have to face these hard emotions, but we want to get past them, if we want to go through them to arrive at a place of true self-worth, of a high value of self-worth for ourselves, how do we do it? Well, it's a good thing that our TED Talk this week comes from none other than the shame expert, Brene Brown. And if you didn't have an opportunity to watch the TED Talk this week, I invite you to go back and watch it when you have an opportunity. But in her work, of her field, she studied thousands upon thousands of people with this one question: what separates people who have a high value of self-worth when they look at themselves in the mirror and those who have a low sense of self-worth? What is the differentiating factors? There is one. That's it. There's one differentiating factor between having a high value of self-worth or a low value. And it is the belief that you are worthy of belonging. Not that you actually do belong to any group, but simply that you believe that you are worthy of belonging. And Brené's work goes to break that down further, because you might go, that's great, but how do I do that? So there's 3 key components to understanding how you arrive at this place of worthiness of belonging. Courage, the willingness to bear your heart, as it gets translated into Latin. Compassion literally means to suffer with. In today's terms, we like to use the word empathy. And third is connection, your willingness to be in community. So when you have these 3 things, when you're willing to take courage, when you're willing to connect, and when you're willing to have compassion, it means that you're in a place where you are willing to accept who you are, where you are. You're not trying to arrive at some future envisioned or pitch a perfect person of who you want to be to the people that you're in front of. You just offer who you are authentically to the people you are in front of. That's it. And that takes vulnerability. But in vulnerability, we find our most authentic selves. And in vulnerability, we find what makes us beautiful. And we find that place of belonging that leads to that identity marker of a high self-worth. And in all of these TED Talks that we keep coming across, one of my favorite things is that this wisdom that sometimes feels like new wisdom. Brené Brown is a household name, right? And she is someone who's deeply beloved, and she gives us these great grapple holds around these hard emotions on how to talk to them, how to move through them, and how to arrive at these great places. And yet, the wisdom that she offers us is wisdom that we can turn back to our scriptures. And Brené, as a Christian herself, would say this herself, and we can find this wisdom contained therein as well. And so this morning, I want us to turn to a very familiar passage of scripture where we're going to see these truths lined out. That when we're willing to have courage and compassion and connection, truly transforming, beautiful things happen. And I want to zoom in to one small piece of a very familiar passage in Luke chapter 15. You're going to pick up real fast what it is. And we're going to start in verse 20. So he got up and went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then his son said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fattened calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. We see a 20-minute TED Talk summarized in 4 verses of a parable. in the story of the prodigal son, the son wants his half of the inheritance. He goes and he squanders it, and he realizes in his squalor that if he was willing to return home, to just be a servant in his father's household, he could have a better life than the utter travesty his life had become. And so the story where we pick back up in is the son having the courage, the willingness to bare his heart and to return home, to request to just be a servant in his father's household. And upon returning home, he arrives to a father that not only welcomes him, but runs out to greet him. And his father greets and meets him with the identity of, "You are my beloved son." He doesn't identify him as, "You are my screw-up son. You are my son that has wasted half of my wealth. You are my son that has brought shame upon the family." And he could have used any of those things, but instead he just said, "You are my son." We see vulnerability, and it quite literally says that the father had compassion. The father was willing to suffer with his son. And as a parent myself, and looking out in the parents in this room, we know a thing or two about suffering with our children, do we not? We know what it means to have compassion on our kids. And what happens at the end is there's connection between the two. And the result is we see that what comes of it is celebration. When we're willing to be vulnerable with one another, vulnerability is the place of resurrection. It brings life, it brings love, it brings joy, and it brings creativity. And when we zoom back out and remember that this is a parable, this is a story that Jesus is telling, we can ask ourselves the question of, who is Jesus telling this story to? He's telling this story to tax collectors. He's telling these story to people who are the prodigal son of their own communities, who are longing to be accepted and welcomed back. And Jesus is saying, you can have that. In fact, I love that throughout Scripture, it says 6 different times that Jesus has compassion on people. Jesus has compassion for the bent over woman in Luke chapter 13. Jesus has compassion at the end of the Beatitudes, where he's taught this crowd over a long period of time at the end of Matthew chapter 9. And Matthew 14, as he is still grieving the death of John the Baptist, it says that he has compassion on the crowd, and so he feeds the 5,000, and then he turns around and he does it again by having compassion on the crowd 3 days later and feeding the 4,000. And then again in Matthew chapter 20, Jesus would have compassion on the 2 blind men. Jesus is telling us over and over again, I am your parent. I am the one who will identify you as your self-worth, as beloved, as son, as daughter. I don't know about you, but sometimes going to someone who will identify you just like that might help when you've been staring in the mirror just a little too long, nitpicking things that don't exist, that are phantom and ghosts in the mirror, that you need to release and let go so that your light and love can shine brightly and you can offer to the world the goodness of what it means for you to belong. Because in belonging, you invite others to come and belong.